The Celestial Institute of Advanced Warfare Studies perched on Europa Station like a monument to military pretension, its obsidian towers gleaming with the kind of architectural arrogance that screamed we take ourselves very seriously to anyone unfortunate enough to approach. Founded by the Keth Mori hegemony 3 centuries ago, the Institute had earned its reputation as the galaxy's premier military academy through the simple expedient of accepting only the most privileged offspring of warrior species, and then charging them astronomical fees to learn theoretical combat from instructors who hadn't seen actual battle since the Outer Rim skirmishes ended 50 years ago. The Academy's crown jewel was its fear conditioning program, a curriculum designed to forge elite officers by exposing cadets to controlled doses of terror under carefully supervised conditions. Because nothing quite prepared future military leaders like experiencing mortal dread in a classroom setting with emergency medical teams standing by. The program had produced some of the galaxy's most decorated officers, assuming one-counted medals awarded for administrative excellence and diplomatic cocktail party attendance. Commandant Jack Tel Mordun embodied everything the Keth Mori species aspired to be: 7 feet of crystalline warrior aristocracy, his translucent form refracting light in patterns that had been mathematically calculated for maximum intimidation factor. His office walls displayed enough commendations to paper a space station, most of them for excellence in educational leadership and outstanding contribution to theoretical warfare studies. The closest he'd come to actual combat was a heated budget meeting with the Academy's board of directors, but his students didn't need to know that. The morning's roster read like a comprehensive guide to galactic nepotism. Veldar Krixnuther's insectoid form clicked with barely contained aggression, his mandibles polished to mirror brightness. Because apparently even in a species evolved for ripping prey apart, personal grooming remained a priority. His family's high fleet controlled 3-star systems, which made him technically qualified for military leadership in the same way that owning a kitchen made someone a chef. Crixana Luzemba floated near the classroom center, her energy being physiology crackling with controlled plasma discharges that were supposedly intimidating, but mostly just made the room smell like ozone and burnt electronics. She'd spent most of her life in climate-controlled energy matrices, experiencing combat through high-end simulation programs that her parents' diplomatic immunity had ensured she never failed. Hoth UK Gravemash represented the Thurok Dominion's contribution to galactic military education, 800 pounds of scaled muscle and barely contained violence, with the intellectual depth of a particularly aggressive asteroid. His idea of tactical planning involved pointing at things and suggesting they be hit until they stopped moving, which might have been effective if anyone had ever actually let him hit anything more dangerous than practice targets. And then there was Zilmarie Thessere, whose telepathic abilities were supposed to make her a formidable psychological warfare specialist. In practice, her mental powers were primarily used for cheating on exams and avoiding conversations with classmates she found boring, which was most of them. Her family's psychic research conglomerate had purchased her admission through a generous donation to the Academy's Mental Warfare Development Fund. These were the galaxy's future military leaders, pampered, privileged, and possessed of exactly the kind of theoretical courage that evaporated the moment anything genuinely dangerous entered the room. In the back corner, occupying a seat that seemed designed to emphasize her status as an afterthought, sat the Institute's first and only human exchange student. Riley Nakamura had arrived 8 months ago as part of some diplomatic initiative to foster interspecies military cooperation, which was Academy speak for let's see if the primitives can keep up with real education. The other cadets had initially found their human classmate mildly fascinating in the way one might be fascinated by a particularly well-trained pet. Look, it understands basic tactics. See how it operates complex equipment. Isn't it remarkable how it grasps concepts that should be beyond its evolutionary development? This fascination had quickly cooled into polite indifference when Riley proved disappointingly normal. No impressive physical adaptations, no specialized combat organs, no instinctive warrior behaviors that the other species could recognize and respect. Commandant Jack Tel had made appropriate accommodations for his developmentally challenged cadet, providing simplified cost materials and extended deadlines, because obviously someone from a species that had barely achieved faster-than-light travel would need extra assistance understanding advanced military theory. The fact that Riley consistently scored in the Academy's top 5 percentile was clearly just institutional charity. The instructors were probably inflating her grades out of diplomatic courtesy. The human sat quietly through lectures, submitted assignments that met every technical requirement, and participated in training exercises with a kind of competent mediocrity that suggested she was trying very hard to keep up with her more naturally gifted classmates. Her personnel file listed her previous experience as civilian volunteer work, which the Academy's administration had generously interpreted as some sort of primitive community service, rather than anything resembling actual military background. Attention, future defenders of galactic civilization. Commandant Jack Tell announced with the theatrical flair that had made him legendary among military educators who confused volume with authority. His crystalline form caught the classroom's lighting in patterns specifically designed to project leadership charisma, though the effect was somewhat undermined by the fact that everyone present had been trained to recognize such obvious psychological manipulation techniques. The cadets straightened with the kind of eager attention that expensive educations were supposed to instill, their various species-specific displays of military bearing creating a rainbow of aggressive posturing that would have been impressive if any of them had ever actually needed to demonstrate courage under fire. Today marks the culmination of your fear conditioning program, Jack Tell continued, his voice resonating with harmonic frequencies calculated to inspire confidence and respect. You will face the ultimate fear assessment, a direct encounter with one of the galaxy's most psychologically devastating predators under controlled laboratory conditions. The excitement in the room was palpable, the kind of anticipatory thrill that came from knowing you were about to experience something genuinely terrifying while remaining absolutely safe. This was what they'd paid for, the rush of confronting ultimate danger with multiple layers of protection between them and any actual consequences. Observe, Jack Tell gestured dramatically as a massive containment unit was wheeled into the classroom by technicians, whose hazard suits suggested they took their jobs considerably more seriously than the Academy took its educational mission. The Nightmare Weaver, interdimensional predator from the void between realities, psychological warfare specialist, and the evolutionary pinnacle of terror-based hunting strategies. The containment unit itself was a masterwork of paranoid engineering that made the Academy's emergency protocols look casual by comparison. Quantum-locked titanium steel composite walls, reality anchor generators to prevent dimensional phase shifting, and enough psychic dampening fields to lobotomize a lesser species. The warning labels were printed in 17 different languages, including 3 that were considered extinct and 2 that were classified as too dangerous for civilian knowledge. Inside the cage, something moved with the fluid grace of living nightmare. The Nightmare Weaver's form defied comfortable description. Part shadow, part geometry that shouldn't exist in standard spacetime, part pure psychological terror given physical form. What glimpses the students could catch through the specialized viewing ports suggested a creature that had evolved specifically to break minds rather than bodies, to turn its victims' own imagination and fear against them until they welcomed death as relief from madness. The creature had been captured by a joint task force of the galaxy's most elite special operations units, a mission that had required 18 months of planning, cost more than most planetary defense budgets, and resulted in a 60% casualty rate among the extraction team. Half the survivors were still in psychiatric treatment, and the other half had requested immediate retirement from active duty. This was what nightmares looked like when they crawled out of the spaces between stars, raw, undiluted terror that could drive entire civilizations insane just by existing in their general vicinity. Magnificent in its horror, Jack Tell preened as his students stared in fascinated revulsion at their contained doom. Note the reality distortion field that allows it to exist partially outside normal spacetime, the psychic projection capabilities that can induce permanent madness from a distance of several light years, and the dimensional phase shifting that makes it effectively immortal by conventional definitions. The Nightmare Weaver tested its containment with casual movements that sent the monitoring equipment into cascading alarm states, its very presence causing reality to ripple in ways that made observers' eyes water and their brains itch. Several cadets had already activated their personal shield generators, not because the creature could actually reach them, but because some primal survival instinct was screaming that being in the same room as this thing was fundamentally wrong. Velvar's mandibles were chattering with nervous energy, creating a sound like castanets played by someone having a seizure. Crixana's energy form had dimmed considerably, her plasma discharges flickering with what might charitably be called anxiety. Even Horthuke seemed smaller somehow, his scaled bulk hunched with the unconscious posture of something trying very hard not to be noticed by a superior predator. The beauty of controlled exposure. Jack Tell continued with the confidence of someone who had never been on the wrong side of anything more dangerous than a strongly worded performance review, is that we can study the galaxy's ultimate psychological weapon without the inconvenience of actually experiencing psychological annihilation. The Nightmare Weaver's attention had been focused on testing its quantum locks and reality anchors, probing for weaknesses in the containment system with the patient thoroughness of something that had all the time in several dimensions. Its movements held the fluid certainty of a creature that had never encountered anything it couldn't eventually terrify into submission or madness. That's when it noticed Riley. The change was immediate and impossible to misinterpret. The creature's casual testing of its bonds stopped mid-motion, its form shifting from predatory confidence to something that might generously be called concern and more accurately be described as pants-wetting terror. The Nightmare Weaver, interdimensional horror from the void between stars, psychological warfare specialist and evolutionary pinnacle of terror-based hunting, took one look at the quiet human cadet in the back of the classroom and immediately tried to phase-shift itself as far from her as the laws of physics would allow. Riley, for her part, glanced up from her note-taking with the mild interest of someone who'd just noticed an unusual but not particularly significant detail. Her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. A slight straightening of the shoulders, a barely noticeable change in how she held her head. But suddenly the unremarkable human in the back row looked less like a student and more like something that students should probably avoid making sudden movements around. The Nightmare Weaver's terror was so profound that it began emitting sounds that the universal translator struggled to process, finally settling on something that approximated, "Oh no, oh no, oh no, please make it go away. I'll be good, I promise, just don't let the human look at me like that." The classroom had achieved the kind of silence typically associated with funeral services or the moment before natural disasters. Every cadet was now acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the room's power dynamics, though their expensive educations hadn't prepared them to understand exactly what. Commandant Jack Tell paused mid-lecture, his crystalline form refracting light in patterns that suggested confusion and growing concern. "That's highly irregular. Nightmare Weavers don't exhibit fear responses to any known stimuli. They exist specifically to be the thing that other things are afraid of." The creature had somehow managed to compress itself into the smallest possible configuration within its containment, pressing against the far wall with such desperate intensity that it was probably leaving permanent impressions in the quantum-locked titanium steel. Its reality distortion field was fluctuating wildly, creating visual effects that made everyone's eyes water, but suggested panic rather than predatory confidence. "Interesting specimen," Riley observed conversationally, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive classroom. "Haven't seen one of those since my summer job on the Kepler Station cleanup crew." The phrase cleanup crew landed in the room like an unexploded quantum torpedo. Because surely she didn't mean cleanup, as in actively hunting and exterminating these creatures. That would be insane. That would mean the quiet, unremarkable human was cleanup crew. Zilmarie's telepathic voice carried a distinctly strained quality that her psychic training hadn't prepared her for. Riley shrugged, the gesture somehow making every other cadet remember that they were surrounded by empty space, and that their emergency life support systems had never been tested against someone who might not want them to keep working. Nightmare Weavers are considered a Class A pest species in most human-controlled systems. They tend to nest in dimensional fold spaces near shipping lanes and drive cargo crews insane, which is bad for interstellar commerce. The creature's distress had reached levels that were causing the containment unit's automated systems to flood its cage with every calming agent known to galactic science, none of which were having any measurable effect on its psychological state. "You hunt these things." Horth UK's scaled voice had developed a pitch that suggested his species' intimidating vocal cords were capable of sounds typically associated with small frightened animals. "Hunt is probably the wrong word," Riley explained with the patient tone of someone trying to explain advanced concepts to particularly slow students. Nightmare Weavers are ambush predators that rely on psychological warfare and dimensional phase shifting to avoid direct confrontation. Hunting implies they have some chance of escape or retaliation. She paused, considering her words carefully. "It's more like pest control. You find their dimensional anchor points, collapse their fold space nests, and then wait for them to phase back into normal reality where they can't use their psychological projection abilities effectively. After that, it's just a matter of standard extermination protocols. The Nightmare Weaver had begun emitting sounds that bypassed the universal translator entirely, communicating pure emotional distress in frequencies that made everyone's teeth ache. It was trying so desperately to get away from Riley's general vicinity that it had actually begun damaging its own containment through sheer panic thrashing. Standard extermination protocols. Crixana's energy form was flickering like a badly maintained light fixture. Well, you can't just shoot them while they are phase-shifted, Riley said matter-of-factly. Energy weapons just pass through interdimensional entities. You have to force them back into standard space-time first, then use conventional kinetic weapons or just beat them to death with whatever's handy. The phrase "beat them to death with whatever's handy" created a moment of silence so profound that the room's atmospheric recycling systems became audible. The thing about Nightmare Weavers, Riley continued, apparently oblivious to the rising panic around her, is that they are actually pretty fragile once you get them anchored in normal reality. All that interdimensional phase shifting makes them dependent on being able to slip away when things get dangerous. Take away their escape options, and they are basically just really ugly animals with above-average intelligence. Commandant Jactel's academic brain was having difficulty processing this information. According to every piece of military intelligence in existence, Nightmare Weavers were considered such significant threats that most civilizations classified them as weapons of mass destruction. Yet here was a human cadet casually discussing their extermination like it was routine maintenance work. How exactly? He asked carefully. Because suddenly his classroom's emergency protocols felt woefully inadequate. Does one force an interdimensional predator back into standard spacetime? Riley considered this with the thoughtful expression of someone trying to explain rocket science to particularly gifted children. Humans developed specialized equipment for collapsing dimensional fold spaces after we started expanding into systems where Nightmare Weavers had established territorial claims. The basic principle is to create localized space-time distortions that make phase shifting impossible within a given area. The creature's panic had reached levels that were causing its reality distortion field to malfunction, creating visual effects that made the classroom look like it was being viewed through severely scratched glass. But the real breakthrough, Riley added with what might have been professional pride, was figuring out how to track them through dimensional phase space. Turns out human brain patterns are really good at following nonlinear dimensional signatures. Most other species get lost trying to think in 11 dimensions simultaneously, but humans just sort of adapt. Every cadet in the classroom was now looking at Riley with the kind of careful attention typically reserved for unexploded ordnance or potentially rabid animals. Their expensive military educations had suddenly become irrelevant in the face of someone who discussed hunting interdimensional horrors like other people discussed weekend hobbies. The psychological warfare aspect is actually the most interesting part, Riley continued, her tone taking on the slightly enthusiastic quality of someone discussing a favorite subject. Nightmare Weavers are used to being the thing that other things are afraid of. When they encounter a species that's genuinely not intimidated by them, species that actually finds them annoying rather than terrifying, they experience something completely outside their evolutionary programming. The Nightmare Weaver had somehow achieved an even more compressed configuration, apparently trying to phase shift itself out of existence entirely rather than remain in the same room as Riley. Its distress signals were now registering on equipment 3 decks away. They can't process the concept of being prey instead of predator, Riley explained. Their entire psychological framework is built around being the ultimate terror, the thing that drives other species insane just by existing. When they realize they are not the scariest thing in the room, that they are actually being hunted by something that considers them a minor inconvenience, their minds just break. Professor Jactel was beginning to understand why human diplomatic negotiations tended to be so successful. When your species' idea of routine pest control involved hunting creatures that most civilizations classified as existential threats, most political disagreements probably seemed fairly manageable by comparison. Perhaps, he said carefully, his crystalline voice resonating with frequencies designed to project calm authority, while his internal processes were screaming various forms of panic, we should return the specimen to its secure transport facility. Oh, you don't need to do that for my sake, Riley said pleasantly, settling back into her chair with the casual movement of someone who was exactly where she wanted to be. I'm not working today. This is just educational observation. The distinction between not working today and completely harmless was not lost on anyone present. The Night Weaver's relief was so profound that it actually stopped trying to escape, though it continued to watch Riley with a kind of desperate attention that suggested it couldn't afford to look away even for a moment. The monitoring equipment registered a significant decrease in its stress indicators, though they remained at levels typically associated with severe trauma. The other cadets were having their own realizations about what 8 months of quiet, unremarkable behavior from their human classmate actually represented. Every casual interaction, every polite conversation, every moment of apparent academic struggle suddenly took on new and distinctly more ominous implications. "You've been holding back." Velvar's mandibles produced the words with the careful precision of someone testing the structural integrity of a potentially explosive device. Riley shrugged again, the gesture somehow more significant now that everyone understood what those shoulders were capable of supporting. "This is an educational environment. I'm here to study galactic military theory and interspecies cooperation, not to demonstrate practical applications of interdimensional pest control techniques." The phrase "practical applications" sent a chill through the classroom that the environmental systems couldn't quite compensate for. Besides, Riley added with what was probably meant to be reassurance, humans generally don't hunt sentient species. Night Weavers are barely above animal intelligence. They are pure instinct and psychological projection. We draw the line at anything that can engage in meaningful communication or demonstrate genuine creative problem-solving. The distinction between barely above animal intelligence and fully sentient suddenly seemed both very important and uncomfortably subjective. Commandant Jactel was rapidly recalculating his entire educational philosophy. Clearly, the fear conditioning program needed some significant modifications, starting with mandatory psychological screening for students whose idea of scary involved things that could actually fight back effectively. "Class is dismissed," he announced, his voice maintaining its authoritative resonance through what was probably considerable effort. "Please review the assigned readings on asymmetric warfare and predator recognition patterns. Pay special attention to the sections on threat assessment and the identification of superior opponents." As the cadets filed out with movements that suggested they were trying very hard not to look like they were fleeing, Riley remained in her seat, calmly organizing her materials with the same methodical efficiency she'd displayed for 8 months. The Night Weaver watched her with unblinking attention, its palm pressed against the containment wall, as if trying to maximize the distance between them. "Commandant." Riley's voice carried the politely curious tone that would probably haunt Jactel's dreams for the foreseeable future. "Will next week's curriculum be covering pack hunting coordination? Because humans have developed some interesting variations on traditional multi-unit tactical approaches that might be relevant to advanced military strategy." Jactel's crystalline form flickered with light patterns that his species associated with existential dread. The thought of trying to explain to the Academy's board of directors why the entire advanced warfare curriculum needed to be restructured around avoiding things that their human exchange student considered routine was causing his processors to generate error messages. "I'll review the syllabus and get back to you on that," he managed. As Riley finally gathered her things and headed for the exit, she paused beside the containment unit. The Night Weaver pressed itself even more firmly against the far wall, achieving a level of compressed terror that was probably setting new records for the species. "Don't worry," she said quietly, her voice carrying a casual friendliness that was somehow infinitely more unsettling than any threat could have been. "I'm just here to learn. Academic purposes only." The creature's relief was so intense that it actually slumped against the containment wall, its terror-induced adrenaline crash leaving it looking deflated and somehow smaller than before. After Riley left, the classroom remained silent except for the hum of monitoring equipment and the occasional whimper from what had previously been considered one of the galaxy's most fearsome predators. Commandant Jactel stared at the containment unit, then at the door through which his human student had departed, then back at the creature that was still shaking with residual terror. Somewhere in the administrative offices of the Celestial Institute of Advanced Warfare Studies, requisition forms for a new department titled Human Military Studies, Advanced Survival Techniques, would soon be filed with emergency priority flags. The course description would be brief but comprehensive. Learn to recognize when you're not actually at the top of the food chain. The night my weaver continued to emit the occasional distress sound, periodically glancing toward the door to make sure the human hadn't returned. In its simple, predator-focused mind, one thought circled endlessly. It had never been so grateful to be caged in its entire interdimensional existence. Down the corridor, Riley checked her schedule for the next period. Advanced tactical planning was coming up, followed by interspecies diplomacy and a seminar on psychological warfare applications. Tomorrow she had to present her final project on effective threat assessment in unknown combat scenarios. She was looking forward to it. The assignment specifically requested that students incorporate personal experience into their analysis of how to identify truly dangerous opponents in field conditions. This was going to be educational.